Hey, YouTube friends, this is David here of the David Donnan podcast, and I'm excited to share with you the very first episode of Season 2 as also a video cast. We're going to try to do this with all of our interviews for Season 2. The theme for Season 2 is Even Deeper in Prayer, and we're going to be looking at spiritual formation rhythms and how they can help us grow closer to God and sense God's presence in our life. The very first interview is with my really good friend, the Reverend Dr. Ted Goshorn. Let's get into the interview. Today we have a very special guest joining us, the Reverend Dr. Ted Goshorn. Ted has a passion for equipping churches to transform their communities in the name of Jesus. We're excited to have Ted on the show today to discuss prayer. Ted has a wealth of experience and expertise in this area, and we can't wait to hear his insights and perspectives. During our conversation, we'll be discussing Ted's book, Prayer Changes Us. So without further ado, let's jump into our conversation. Ted, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
This is also going to be the first show where we're going to post the video. So you'll be able to check it out. If you're watching it on YouTube, you are seeing Ted right now. Ted, I got a question for you. What led you to write a book on prayer?
So it's the prompting of a church member at the church I served prior to where I am now. That church was Eastman First UMC in Eastman, Georgia. A dear friend there, Martha Wright, kept bugging me to write a book on prayer. She'd heard me preach some sermons on prayer and felt like that was something that I needed to do. And she finally convinced me to do it. But I'd also wanted to write a book and be published. And I have to say, I'm very grateful to the South Carolina Advocate Press for picking up my book.
Very cool. About how many sermons, ballpark, do you think it was that you had done explicitly on prayer or prayer life that led this church member to say, you have a gift for this, why don't you bound this together in a book?
That's a great question. I don't know. Prayer would feature, you had showed me earlier, you kind of put together an outline of, each chapter following a similar path. And application is usually how I end. And so, which is true of my sermons. And so prayer is often a point of application. But in terms of just speaking specifically to prayer, I'd estimate 5 to 10. And within she started bugging me before the pandemic, right before the pandemic. So 5 to 10 within a 2.5 years span.
Cool. And full disclosure, Ted and I are really good friends. We've known each other since 2012 when we met at License to Preach School. Ted sent me a copy of his book. Here's his book if you're watching on video. And he wrote me a very nice note in the front of it. Another book you got a copy of, although I had to pay for this one. So there's an inside story with us where I'm always trying to get free books.
File your complaint with the South Carolina Advocate Press.
So in the very front of your book, your first line in your introduction is prayer changed me is the first sentence. And then the second sentence is that change began on a plane ride to Chicago. I immediately was like, oh, this is going to be a story where there's turbulence and the plane's going to be bumpy and go down. And you juked me out. You discovered this new form of prayer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the chaplain I tell the story in the introduction, the chaplain at Mercer University, who's a friend of mine, I worked at Mercer before becoming a pastor, had asked me to retool the chapel service and do it in the style of Taizé. So I didn't know much about contemplative prayer at that point, knew nothing about Taizé. I bought what I have come to understand is the gold standard of writing on Taizé, which is called, I'm looking it over because I know exactly where it is on my bookshelf, but it's by Justin Brian Santos. I think it's called The People or a Community Called Taizé. So I read the book, but there's nothing like experiencing the actual service. And there was only one happening at the time in Macon. It wasn't going to fit with my schedule before I needed to launch this new service at Mercer. And I wasn't sure how I was going to experience a service before I actually had to try to run one. And so I got to this conference. I don't even remember what the conference was about, but I got to check in for this conference at Fourth Presbyterian in Chicago, and saw on their board, the church board, not related to the conference, that Friday evenings they had a weekly Taizé service, and it was Friday evening, and it was like 2 hours before the service. So I got to go to the service, experience it. If I were to pull that book off the shelf, I've got a million notes I took inside the book about my experience. And so not only did it facilitate creating that service at Mercer, it became an introduction for me to contemplative prayer. And it's that style specifically that really changed me by introducing me to a style of prayer that I find a lot of congruence with.
Okay, cool. So just briefly, you've talked about Taizé and you said it's contemplated. Can you give a little more, just, 30-second description of what it is for the audience?
So I think my brief definition of prayer in general is anything that causes us to commune with God.
Mm-hmm.
Contemplative prayer is a particular style of that usually has silence as a significant component of the style of prayer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what do you think makes prayer challenging for that just average follower of Jesus?
I think a few things. One is I think that prayer has been pigeonholed into talking with God, and that being about the only form of prayer. Mm-hmm. So whether that's a ritual talking to God of the Lord's Prayer, or going to God and giving a list of needs, or for yourself or others, that form of prayer is called intercessory prayer. And I think too many people think that that's about the only way to pray. Mm-hmm. Or maybe combine that with sitting quietly with your head bowed and your eyes closed while somebody prays during a worship service. So I think that's part of it. I think that having a ritual of prayer in your own life, I think we don't know how to set up habits. And, like at your prayer conference this past Saturday, I talked about how to form habits, because I think we need to know that information to be able to make a regular rhythm of it. I also think that if we're doing prayer well, prayer challenges us because it makes us grow, and growth is not comfortable. And growth comes with having to be honest with ourselves in ways that we may not want to be.
You talked about at our prayer conference, so just so we can fill people in, this past Sunday at the church I serve, Glenville Methodist Church, we had Ted and we had Dr. Brown Russell, who will be on the upcoming episode. And Ted gave a talk a little bit about his book, but also about developing patterns for prayer. What are some of the patterns and some of the way that we can institute patterns in our life that can help us go deeper in our prayer life?
Yeah. So I think first of all, people, when they set up and they decide I'm going to have this regular routine of spiritual practice where maybe they aren't currently regular, the first thing they'll say is I'm going to do it every day. And I think that's not a great way to do it, because I think we need a break even from the good things in life. People who work out a lot will tell you that you don't need to go to the gym 7 days a week. It's good to have a rest day. And I think the same goes for the discipline of being in our spiritual practice. So I don't engage my routine of prayer on Saturdays. Mm-hmm. That's my break day. Mm-hmm. I do it Sunday through Friday pretty regularly. The other thing is, and I won't get
let me stop you on that, because when I heard that you said that, I was kind of shocked that you said that. You're like, take a break from prayer. But what I understood you to mean is, we carve out, if we're doing centering prayer, which we'll talk about on another episode, or some type of longer routine. You're saying don't do that super long routine every day. Obviously, you still pray. On Sunday, you lead prayer. You pray multiple times. You pray, I'm sure, before worship and after worship at mealtime and stuff. You're saying not have a whole day, a Sabbath from actually speaking with God, but maybe a Sabbath from these longer contemplative practices.
Well, and specifically a break from the routine. Mm-hmm. So, my routine is currently my family walks out the door about 6:40 in the morning, and that's the cue for me. And then I start to engage in my routine of prayer. And if you want, I can describe what that looks like. But that obviously they don't walk out the door to go to school at 6:40 in the morning on Saturday. So the cue's not there to begin with. Mm-hmm. but I don't engage in that ritual on Saturdays. So just like, I don't lift, but, I think of our friend Ben that, is pumping iron all the time. He doesn't do that every day of the week. I run. I don't run every day of the week because my body needs those rest days. And so it's the same idea. I still walk on, days that I don't run. I'm still maybe engaging in some prayer, as I go throughout my Saturday, but I'm taking a break from the routine.
Yeah. And that's really helpful because, it's impossible to say, like, I'm going to do this exact same thing every single day. And if I remember right, there's a book called Spiritual Life in the Wesley Tradition, or it has a title on that. It's by Steve Harper. He talks about John Wesley's spiritual practices, and while he did have some core thing, my recollection of it was he was always trying new things and always changing up his patterns, even till the end of his life. Whether it was journaling like every hour about things that he was worried about or a sin he was concerned about, and so I think there's this always open exploration and never getting stuck in the perfect rhythm, but having a rhythm of switching up your rhythm.
Absolutely. And I think I said at your conference, variety is a spice of life. And I think that holds true for our prayer practices as well. And it's important to be willing to adjust and make changes to what that looks like. The other thing that pops in my head from what we're talking about here is that, some practices are good to do on a regular basis. So for us, not necessarily just in general, but are good in a what am I trying to say? I'm losing my it's good to have something we're doing on a regular basis. Then there are other practices we might use on an as needed basis. And so my example was I'm praying with a daily office prayer book 6 days a week, but I'm engaging in journaling on an as needed basis when I feel like I need to go deeper in that way with God. And so I think sometimes we might set ourselves out to say, I just learned about this prayer practice. I'm going to do it every day. And it might be something we just need to use on an as needed basis.
Yeah, that's cool. So your book's title is Prayer Changes Us. What are some specific ways that you think prayer does change us?
Yeah, so I think prayer, to use our Wesleyan phrase, is one of the primary ways that we grow in holiness, that we move on toward perfection. If we think of our faith life as a journey, prayer is, I think, the engine that drives us, toward that growth in holiness. And the way it does that is if we accept my definition of prayer as something that causes us to commune with God, then we are in the presence more closely and more intimately with God. And that can't help but change us and make us more holy. It also causes us, we talked about this briefly a moment ago, to become more aware of ourselves, more honest with ourselves, which means we've got to deal with our sin. We've got to deal with our woundedness. We've got to deal with the parts of us that are imperfect, as part of moving on toward perfection is dealing with those things. And prayer causes those things to come to the surface. But if they're at the surface, then it's easier and more readily available for God to work healing with those sins or with those wounds. So I think about, the way the Enneagram talks about, our woundedness and bringing that before God so that God can experience that healing. The metaphor that I've been finding myself using is, we all are born with the imago Dei, the image of God, and it's shrouded by our own sinfulness. And as we are changed by the practice of prayer, that shroud becomes thinner so that the image of God in us can be more readily seen and is more readily apparent to others.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I like that. The idea of the shroud becoming thinner. That's cool. In your book, you use a big word, theopancy. Did I say it right?
Theophany.
Theophany. Okay. We'll have to edit that out. So, what is it and should we expect it?
Yeah. So a typical theophany, a traditional theophany would be, the definition is just a sensory encounter with God. So, yeah, perhaps the one that might come to people's minds the first would be Paul on the Damascus Road hearing Jesus's voice.
Mm-hmm.
Or you think about like, sorry, I feel like I got to sneeze. Samuel hearing the voice of God and running to Eli to say, you called me, and he's like, no, I didn't call you. Or Moses, and his experience on Mount Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
Those are, prime examples. The Transfiguration is a great example of a theophany. Not necessarily Jesus being transfigured, but the experience of the disciples hearing and experiencing the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we should expect it. That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they are an act of grace by God. It's a gift of God to experience God in that kind of sensory way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I certainly feel like there are many times when I'm engaged in prayer, especially contemplative prayer, that I feel like I experience the peace of God. I don't know that that quite qualifies as a theophany, but so that's why I think we should expect to experience an attribute of who God is
Mm-hmm.
when we're engaged in prayer. Not every time, but I think frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Peace, love, joy, name fruits of the Spirit, conviction as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, I mean, I've had a couple of theophanies in my own life. It hasn't been hearing the voice of God, but it's been a very sensory kind of experience. So for me, it's something that I don't know that I expect will happen again, but I take as a gift
Mm-hmm.
that God has given me, that it's just out of God's good nature that furthers me on toward perfection.
Yeah. I think I've had some things happen to me that I would describe in that category, or those sensory experiences of God that are very strong. And then sometimes in my quiet time, maybe I have these smaller versions of that. But then most of the time, I don't know, maybe not most of the time, but there's a good chunk of the time where you go and you pray and you don't really feel anything. And I think that's okay for us to expect that. There's something about just having the routine, even if we don't. I was reading I was actually looking for a quote in Screw Tape Letters for a sermon, which is a story about a fictitious demon writing to another demon, about how to trip up people of faith and keep them away from God. And one of the things that I look back on was, one of the demons was coaching his nephew, and he said, make the patient, the Christian, think their prayer is just about their experiences only. And sometimes we can think that, like, oh, well, I'm not doing it right if I don't have this super deep experience. And sometimes
Right.
it's
Yeah.
an accumulation of just going through the routine, and where you do have some of those breakthroughs.
That's right. And I think you raise a really important point. I tell the story in one of the early chapters about the power going out at our house, and it going out at night. It's pitch black, and storms going on outside. I can't find the flashlight, and my oldest son Jackson knew exactly where it was, and because he had been putting it back, different spot that I remembered it being, but he had been putting it back when he used it in the exact same spot. So he was able to immediately go to where the flashlight was, even in the dark, and get it. And the house we lived in at the time, the parsonage in Eastman, was it was very dark if it was stormy at nighttime and the power was out. So that was an example of what the routine of prayer does for us. That when things are good, if we will be consistent in going to God in prayer and engaging in our spiritual disciplines, when the darkness comes, and it happens to all of us, we find ourselves in the valley of the shadow of death, we know exactly where to go find God. We know exactly how to find our way back to God, even in the darkness, just like Jackson finding the flashlight, because we've been going there over and over again. So I think that routine, even if we feel like it's not doing much, is so important for that reason.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to tell that story in a sermon one day. I remember that was so good. Let me actually read what you said, because it's very beautiful. You had told the story about your son and the flashlight. You say, we know just where the flashlight is because we've been going to it over and over again before the darkness settled in. God is our light in the dark times. If we're good about going back to the light in prayer over and over again when times are good, if we maintain discipline, it's very easy to find the light when the darkness settles into our life. And finding the light means we're safe, secure, unmoved, unshaken, and unterrorized. You're a very gifted writer.
Well, thank you, David.
So you talk about a lot of different, like each chapter is almost like looking through a kaleidoscope at a different way of prayer. You talk about the Enneagram and how it's a helpful tool. Why don't you just explain what it is? And if somebody's interested in checking it out, where's a good place to begin?
Yeah, that's great. I wish Dana was here, my wife. She's the resident expert.
I wish she was here too.
She's the resident expert. She, of all the people I know of who are familiar with the Enneagram, she knows it the best. When she first started to learn about it, I thought that it was just another personality inventory. I have a background in counseling, and I was like, I've had enough of these. The Myers-Briggs is useful to a point, and that point's pretty short. I felt that way about other ones. The Enneagram's not that way. The Enneagram, so where like say Myers-Briggs or some other personality inventory seeks to describe our personalities either from as neutral of a point as they can make it, or from a place of our best and trying to help us understand what our best is. The Enneagram starts from our woundedness and starts from a place of how we operate out of those wounds, and how self-awareness of that is one of the ways that we can bring those wounds up to the surface and then present them to God for healing. Not that God can't heal it without us bringing it up, but there's something powerful that happens when we have that awareness, and through our spiritual life, bring that before God to be able to wrestle with it and find healing over time. So I very much feel like it's just another way of describing moving on toward perfection. There are 9 types. They are, there's all sorts of ways. There's wings, and there's where you go, your default type, and then where you go in stress and where you go in health. But I would start, if I was interested, there's a book called The Road Back to You by Ian Morgan Cron, Cron. The Road Back to You. And I think that's the best play. There are so many books on the Enneagram. Some of them are crazy deep. But I think that's the one to start with because it's a good overview. It's accessible. I use it in premarital counseling a lot because they'll come in and they say, we want to learn how to communicate better. We want to understand each other better. And so I use that as a primer and then have them identify their types and read about each other's types and their types. And it creates a lot of great conversation to help each other understand each other more deeply.
I was looking up, if you're watching online, I'm looking around. I've considered myself an Enneagram agnostic till really last fall, early winter. And I read a book. That's why I was looking to see if it was up there so I could tell you who wrote it. But it was about on my actual Enneagram type. It was on Enneagram 3. That's mine. And it really led me to have a breakthrough about Enneagram 3 is like an achievement based personality type, and that's where your deficiencies are. And it led me to write down the sticky phrase that's a part of my affirmations that I look through from time to time. And it's this since I'm achievement based, it's no matter the application of my skills, it doesn't affect how God feels about me. I'm loved, I'm cherished, I'm a child of God. And so for me, coming out of achievement and kind of understanding that in those days where I feel like, oh man, I'm just a huge piece of trash, I haven't accomplished enough. Like I can, I'm not saying that that just automatically cures that from happening, but it's a tool to say, oh, there it is. And here's, kind of this phrasing that I can use to help me get out. So I found that helpful. So I have to look at that book. I have to consider too, like how to do that in premarital counseling. We do the love languages, which is helpful. Trying to find out what your love language is, but I think that could be some easy application. Try to figure out how to package it. You only have so much time with couples before you get them hitched, but I can see how that'd be a super fruitful thing.
Yeah. Well, I think the quote you read is really beautiful, and that's the great point about what the Enneagram is can do. I'm gonna sneeze here at some point. All right, let's keep going.
um, yes, it is allergy season. This is the
Yes, it
first
is.
episode of season 2. I've not picked up smoking since the end of season 1. It's just that I have a little bit raspier voice. It's actually a lot better than what it was. But yes, it is pollen season in Georgia at the time of this recording.
It
You
is.
talk
Go ahead.
you talk a lot about how prayer can lead to self-awareness. Have you ever met anybody who prayed a lot and didn't have a lot of self-awareness? I have. What would you what would you attribute that to?
Um, it's an interesting question. And yeah, full disclosure, he sent me the questions ahead of time. I had to think about this one. And I think one of the important points I want to raise is that, and I talk about this in the book too, prayer is not a tool for self-improvement, and prayer is not a tool for self-awareness. It's not something we utilize in order to improve ourselves. It's something we utilize, and in utilizing it, we become better, but we become better so that we can better reveal God into the world, so we can better serve God in the way that God has called us to be in this world and do our part to help build the kingdom of God. So I want to say that at the outset, to say if the thought is use my book or use the Enneagram just for the purposes of self-awareness, or use prayer just for the purposes of self-awareness to improve upon ourselves, it's a misuse. It's in a different meaning. And I think I'm getting to answer your question. I think a lot of times we think of prayer as transactional. So we say prayer changes things, and we say, if I pray, things change. If I pray, God provides. If I pray, God does, fill in the blank. And prayer is not transactional. Prayer is conversational, the way that we have a relationship with other humans. Prayer is related, although not the same, to what you and I are doing right now. So I think that if there are people who are praying a lot and are unchanged by that prayer is failing to cause them to commune with God. And perhaps that's because they are seeing prayer as transactional, or something similar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Pete Scazzaro has his emotionally healthy spirituality,
Yeah.
and he talks about how like you can go through like your whole life and kind of stay at this surface level. And he talks about the icebergs, his big metaphor about all the stuff underneath. And so I
Yeah.
think you're right. Like if you just keep your prayer life just at like, bless my family, bless my finances, help this person who's sick. Um, you can do that, and you can probably have a fruitful spiritual life and impact God's kingdom. But there's a part where, you know, when you start pausing and thinking and asking God to reveal stuff to you that is very uncomfortable, and something that I'm not good at, but I'm aware enough to know like it's a part that I need to work on. So much of like as a pastor, you are praying for people, you're intervening for people, you're leading prayer and worship, and you can again neglect that part of like saying, God, create in me a clean heart, the
Mhm.
Psalm 51, I think it is.
Yep.
And so I think that can happen to church people, and I just want us to
Mhm.
challenge them to not stay there and challenge ourselves too.
Go deeper. Yeah, and I think to not see it as transactional, I think also, to pivot a little bit, uh, when I read your question, I thought, well, I know self-aware people who aren't religious and I don't think pray.
Hmm.
So it's possible to become very self-aware and not be engaged in prayer. So self-awareness is it should be a consequence of our prayer lives, because we need to become more self-aware so that we do less harm and do more good. Use our two of our three general rules. But it's not, to reinforce my point, prayer is not a tool to become self-aware. I hope
Hmm.
that makes sense.
No, that definitely. No, I think you got to have both those parts too. Yeah, you can't just use it as a hack, as is the term is popular, but it will eventually do that as God changes you, but it's not used in that way to just create a hack to make yourself a better person. Um, Your appendix of your book is one of the best appendixes in a book I've seen. Like, if this is the sales pitch for your book, the appendix alone is worth it, because you have praying through scripture, a year how to do it, and you kind of mix it up. You have different guides. You have the Wesley Covenant prayer. You have a lot of different things. To you, what is your favorite prayer practice right now?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the sales pitch. I wrote the book to be a practical guide to prayer. I didn't want to do a deep theological dive, although there's plenty of theology in there. I wanted it to be a practical guide. And so the appendices are the way that I'm wanting to resource people to be able to engage in different kinds of prayer. So I have two answers to your question. Daily office is my current favorite practice. There's different versions of that. I'm currently using Word on Fire, which is a Catholic resource. And
Yeah,
so
my dad uses that one.
okay, yeah. So occasionally I run into, prayers to saints or prayers to Mary. I just skip over those. But they don't actually happen that frequently. But I really like how they do that. And it's a subscription-based service. So I'll put a little plug in for them. It's $7 a month. You go to just Google Word on Fire. And about the middle of the month, I get the next month's book.
Do you get the paperback copies?
Yeah.
Is what it is? Yeah. Yeah.
So I get the next month's book and just kind of walk through it. There's some other subscription-based services like that. There's Daily Bread. There's and I can actually see it. There's a box in the far, let's see, there. That box is The Divine Hours by Phyllis Tickle. And that's the same idea, is a daily rhythm of prayer, the daily office. But I'd also say that prayer journaling is the most fruitful practice for me, because if I'm wrestling with something, struggling with something, really needing to seek God about something, I find that to be a really productive practice. But it probably will come as no surprise. One of the best ways for me to think is by writing. So, prayer journaling is one of those ways that I'm able to help process things.
How often do you go back and look at your old prayer? Like, I journal a lot, and I hardly ever go back. I feel like I need to. Do you ever go back and look at your old prayers and like say, "Oh, God answered this," or just like, "Oh, that was something that was on my mind, and now it's no longer an issue"? Or do you just kind of like the process is you just writing out the prayers and that helps you?
Yeah, I'd say it's a great question. Maybe once or twice a year, but it's not usually like I'm just going back for the sake of going back. It's usually I'm wrestling with something and something reminds me, like, I dealt with something similar, at this point, and then I'm able to go pull that journal from that time period, and kind of go back through those prayers and see. And that has at times been fruitful, at other times it has not been fruitful, because I'll go back and I'll be like, well, this isn't nearly as applicable as I thought that it was. But other times there are where I'm like, oh man, I learned this lesson and I forgot it. And it helps me to, bring that back up.
Yeah. How has your practice of journaling your prayers like changed over time? Are you just like writing every detail out of the prayer? Or are you just writing things you're interceding for? Has that changed over time?
Yeah, it has. It I'm trying to think how it has changed over time. There was a point that I wanted to be more ritualized with it, and then, said, no, this needs to be on an as needed basis. So that has changed. I think I've become more and more honest with myself, because there are times that I'll feel kind of a hesitation when I'm about to write something and I don't want to admit it. And it's become easier to get over that hump and say, no, I'm going to confess to this. Because there is something powerful about writing that gets stuff out in a way that speaking it, or especially just thinking it, doesn't. So that has been really powerful. I've been praying with the Rule of Greenbow, and Greenbow House of Prayer is a prayer retreat center located within the bounds of the South Georgia Annual Conference. I guess United or Global in this case, east of Dublin, Georgia. And so part of me praying with the Rule has been praying about living into their 7 areas, the 7 parts of their rule, the sacrament of the present moment, spiritual reading, spiritual direction, those kinds of things. So that has evolved as well. I think I might come up with something else, but I think that's primarily how it has evolved.
Yeah, I looked in our group of preachers where me and Ted and 5 other preachers fellowship. He posted um his list of what are they called, vows for Greenbow? What would you call that? Kind of a rule of life
The
is what
7
he.
rules.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a rule of life.
he had shared that he adopted that, and it said one of the things I saw was it said do heady things, or quiet mental things in the morning, and in the afternoon do your hard labor. And so I guess you're gonna have to start lifting weights in the afternoons or doing something to do your hard labor in the afternoon. So
No thanks.
hey Ted, so you've written a book on prayer, and you say it's your first book. It's your first book published by somebody else, but you had a really good book of Psalm sermons that you churned out and self-published, and that was really good. What advice would you give to either a layperson or a preacher who's considering bounding some of their material that they think in book form might help the church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one is persistence. Um, I sent, this is not the first book that I have tried to get published. Yeah, there were 2 others that I self-published that are really just a collection of sermons. And here, several of these chapters started out their lives as sermons, but then I went through and I did a lot more editing. One of the things, David, you pointed out is that I've got this paragraph at the start of each chapter, and then I say, let us begin. And that's a thread that I pulled through. And that was part of my editing and became part of the conclusion, because the introduction, or chapter 1, and the conclusion are completely new material. So I would say, like, it's important to refashion that work that we may have already done, to put it in book form, but then just to be persistent in bugging publishers. And the way I found South Carolina Advocate was through one of the United Methodist News Services. They happened to, I don't know if the Advocate Press had taken out an ad, or if it was just UMNS highlighting that the communications arm of the South Carolina Annual Conference had decided to found a publishing house. And so I sent them, my proposal, which I downloaded off of Westminster John Knox Press. They had a guide for how to write a book proposal, and so I just followed the guide. So I think be persistent. I also think previous proposals I had sent out, I had not finished the book, and it was helpful in this case, I think, that the book was done.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got the acceptance of my proposal last July, I was able to immediately send that over and then start to work with the editor.
Cool. Ted, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I also want to thank you for your friendship. Since the last episode is dropped, I'm no longer United Methodist pastor. I'm recognized as an elder in the Global Methodist Church and will be ordained later this year. And Ted has been just a great model of how, even though we're now in different denominations, how we can continue to work together on things we agree on. And there's so much more we agree on. And so I just want to thank you for being a great model for how the future can look in all streams of Methodism.
Well, I really appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, talk about my book. And it reminds me, I'm going to pull my copy just to make sure I say this right. I was about to say it wrong. Chapter 1 is titled Relationship Over Rules. And that's really a mantra for me, is that, we may have areas of disagreement, but our relationship with each other matters far more than rules do. And I think that God models that God cares more about being in relationship with us than about making sure that we're following everything that God expects us to do, although we should be striving to do that. So I too am grateful for 11 years of friendship, for our S3 group. So shout out to them. We've referenced them a couple of times, and appreciate this opportunity.
Ted, if people want to buy your book or find more information about you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So the best way to buy the book is just off of Amazon. It's available there in Kindle format as well as paperback. So just search Prayer Changes Us. I pop right up. And then learn more about me. I have a website, tedgoshorn.org.
Cool.
And my last name, I guess it'll be on the podcast, right?
Yeah, why don't you spell it out loud in case somebody's listening? But we'll have show notes. We'll have links to that Word on Fire, to Green Bow, to your Twitter, and anything that you want us to link to. But why don't you go ahead and spell your last name for everybody?
Goshorn.
So that's Reverend Dr. Ted Goshorn. Well, that's usually the end of most podcasts, but we have a rapid fire round. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. What is the favorite book you have ever read outside of the Bible?
So I think anything by Ken Follett. He wrote the series that starts with Pillars of the Earth. I really like his fiction.
All right. This is kind of a question, I think I know the answer. What's your favorite spiritual formation practice?
Praying with a daily office.
Okay. Who is the early church father or theologian you would most like to have a conversation with?
Irenaeus.
What's your favorite vacation spot?
We have a house in North Carolina.
It's a mountain house, so I could have guessed that too. What advice would you give to your younger self?
Don't plan it out. Just take it one day at a time. Sacrament of the present moment.
Awesome. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, Ted.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks, David.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and congratulations on making it all the way to the end. If you'd like to find links to Facebook, Twitter, or see more blog posts that I've published, head over to daviddonnan.com, where you can read about the future of Methodism, see some sermons and other articles that I've written that I think will add a lot of value. Thanks.